I had one other sort of informal. We're excited to have Stuart here today. I wanted you to notice that we have matching ties, and it's very color coordinated. We've been in wardrobe for about 3 hours now trying to get ready for this. Seriously, if you have a question, and I'll stop, not just for a Q&A session, but also to, as we launch into a topic, I'll turn to you and say, do you have a question to do? If you do, please state your name and what degree program you're with, so that Stuart will have an idea of whether you're in the MHC or the Executive MBA or the MBA or MSF classes. It'll give them a little bit of a level set, and so with that, I'll start. I'm just delighted today to have Stuart. Stuart is the Chief Operating Officer for Korn Ferry's talent management and talent identification and leadership programs. And I think that's a mouthful. So let's start with telling me, what does that mean? What does a COO of that organization do? What practice do you lead for Korn Ferry?
So, first of all, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm just delighted. I've been affiliated with what Jim's doing and with the school for 4 years, I want to say. And you know, what Owen is doing in the space of leadership development, which I'll answer the question. I won't dodge the question here. Is fantastic. I really think it's some of the leading edge work that's being done in business education. So I applaud you, and I think what you're doing here is fabulous. What my firm does, many of you know Korn Ferry as the executive recruitment business, right? And that's about 70% of our revenues as a business come from that. We're about $800 million, 3,000 or 4,000 people globally. We're the largest executive recruiter in the world. A number of years ago, 5 or 6 years ago, 7 years ago, something like that, we made a real effort to do the next thing after recruiting an executive, which is to help develop that individual. And these were questions that had come up for years around executive recruitment and placement, which is, you found us an executive, or you found me to go into this role. What now? How do I pull my team together? How do I develop my next steps? How do I need to be coaching and developing my leadership team? What does leadership mean for us? So all those questions that companies like Korn Ferry were getting for years, we've been around for 40 years, we finally started saying, you know what, let's address those questions, and let's create a consulting group, which is about 300 people, which I am the COO for, to help address those questions. So we develop leaders in many of the same ways that you're experiencing. The things that we do that show up in your program, you'll be happy to know, are exactly the same tools and techniques we use for leaders in the largest corporations in the world. So we develop leaders in many, many different ways. We help identify future high potential leaders, succession plan leaders. We help with succession planning in and of itself, and so forth. So really the whole question of talent and leadership, and how that cascades through the organization, which is a whole nother area, is what we concern ourselves with.
So we're going to come back later in this conversation to where you are today, how you got there. But you grew up in Northern California. Where?
I grew up in Calistoga, which you know. Calistoga is in the Napa Valley, for those who know that. And when I was growing up, it was not the tourist destination it is today. So it was a sleepy little town, 34 people in my graduating class. And my high school was 7th through 9th grade, so it was only 250 people in my whole high school.
I know Calistoga because I cycled through it on a trip through the wine country a couple of years ago, and lovely place, and I guess it's grown a good bit since you were there, but not a big town, not a big city.
Right.
So, what were your ambitions when you were growing up? What did you want to do?
I wasn't sure, to be totally honest with you, and what drew me all along fairly early in my career, I became very interested in people, generally speaking,
right,
and what makes people effective in whatever endeavor they're pursuing. And so I naturally gravitated towards experiences where I was leading teams, and so I was the yearbook editor, and I was the vice president of our school, small school, so you could do multiple things. But then in my career, I naturally started becoming interested in how people work in teams and how they become individually effective. I had no words for it when I was 23 years old. I did not know what it was, and this was back in the mid-'80s. But it was my natural proclivity. And so over time, that became kind of the unifying theme throughout my career choices was trying to get teams to be effective as a leader, but secondarily trying to understand what motivated people, what made for effective teams.
So you didn't pick out and say, I want to be COO of Korn Ferry since I was 7 or anything like that?
No, not at all.
No clear career path this way, is that right?
Not necessarily. I'm kind of embarrassed to admit, you're supposed to sit in a chair like this and say, well, of course, I knew exactly what the roadmap looked like. And it's interesting, we were talking a little bit before, and I was reflecting on this kind of question. There's this tension between having a plan and having the flexibility to adjust, right? And oftentimes, I've seen this with my own career, and I've seen it with many other people's careers. You don't know what you need until you make a move. So you might need to get to point C, but you don't know point C exists until you're at point B. You literally have no clue, right? There's a wonderful story. Who's read the Steve Jobs speech at Stanford 5 or 6 years ago, his commencement speech? He talks about studying, he for those who didn't read it, he was at Reed College in his undergraduate days. And he
for a very short period of time.
Very short period of time. In fact, I don't even think he was enrolled, was he? He was a concurrent student or something.
I think he was a renegade attending classes as an auditor or something.
Right. And he studied calligraphy, and people asked him, what the heck are you studying calligraphy for? It was a passion of his. He would not have been able to probably articulate it more than it's a passion. Well, it turns out that he used that skill, calligraphy, in studying text, as a way to conceive of the way the font should look on the Mac, right? And if you think about the Mac products, one of the distinguishing characteristics from the very beginning is the uniqueness of the way it looks. It is part of the brand. If you think about the font shape, right? It's a part of the Apple brand. You can't separate it. And you try to put a price tag, the value of that font. It's in the billions, right? If you look at the revenues they generated and so forth. So again, he would never have known that I need to step over here in order to build the business that I'm creating, but you eventually get there. So it illuminates over time.
Yeah. The illustration he was using is interesting. How many of you read Jobs' biography? Anybody read that? One? Okay. That's probably our next book club book or something, just so you'll have a deep dive. But it's an interesting book, and there's a story behind that story that's really, really interesting. Went to college at Berkeley?
My undergrad at UC Davis, a University of California school. Yeah. Studied economics.
Economics,
Yep.
okay. So you weren't in the far left field of
No.
Okay. That would have been the Berkeley campus alone.
Right.
Okay.
That was great.
And then you eventually went to B school there.
Yeah, at Berkeley.
At Berkeley. But you had some interruption in between. What did you do between undergraduate and graduate school?
So this is kind of a similar, on the same theme we were talking about. I was late when I went to business school. I was 32, I think, when I enrolled. And I had spent 3 years after undergrad on the Pacific Bell, was one of the Bell operating companies, like Bell South was here in the old AT&T days. Right after they split up in the early 80s, I went and worked for 3 years on their management development track and hated it from day one. Just hated it. I was young. I was 23. I was managing large teams, 100+ teams of unionized workers, most of which were twice my age. And it was just a very, very challenging time. It turns out that those things you hate the most sometimes are very, very fruitful and valuable as a leader. But left after 3 years and went to Japan and taught English in Japan, somewhat on a lark, to be honest with you, but I wanted a global experience, and I wanted to do something exciting, frankly, and fun. And went to Japan and taught English for businesses. In Japan, I was kind of a consultant that was farmed out to different businesses throughout the Kansai region, which is in Osaka, not the Tokyo region. I came back and had developed a passion while I was there. This is going to sound a bit circuitous. When I was in Japan, developed a passion for Japanese history and for documentary filmmaking. So spent the next 5 years aspiring to be a Japanese history professor while learning the film business. And these were kind of two parallel interests at the same time. Didn't get into graduate school after 3 years of studying the language, a history program. Turns out that the program I applied to, they took 1 out of 100, and it wasn't me. Actually did make a film that made it to the, I was a part of a team that did this, that made it to the theater circuit and was shown on TV, and we won an Emmy for sound production. It wasn't the most sexy Emmy, but it was an Emmy nonetheless.
You know, you didn't have to admit that. You could have just said we won an Emmy.
But in that process, again, on this theme of you can't get to see until you've gotten to be, I became much clearer through that about my interest in organizations, my interest in people. I was running a small film company at the time. I was the general manager of a small film company, and what that had an interesting effect of doing was, it was myself and 4 artists, and I had to run this company, and what that meant was, really what it meant was making sure we had enough cash coming in that exceeded the cash going out. And I had studied accounting in undergrad, but I didn't learn it, if you know what I mean. You know, Mark Twain has a wonderful phrase. He says, "I never let my schooling get in the way of my education." And that's what this was. And I learned, okay, that's right, all those accounting things I learned. Yeah, what this means is I've got to make the call to our creditor to tell them I can't pay them until next week, right? That was accounting. That was real accounting, right? So I learned, what was interesting was that when I went to Accenture after business school, and I was there for 12 years, and I was a strategy consultant, and so I spent my time coming up with all these elegant, great ideas about what our clients should and shouldn't do. And it all came down to these fundamentals that I learned in this film business. Is that going to bring cash in the door? And are we going to be able to do something with that capital?
Right.
Or are we going to find ourselves having to make calls to our creditors, you know, asking for forgiveness? And, you know, at the end of the day, that kind of experience was invaluable.
So if you think about, you know, lessons learned along the way, you talk about this, what are some other lessons, leadership lessons, life lessons that as you progressed through Accenture and finally came to Korn Ferry, give us some examples of what kinds of things stuck with you.
One of the biggest ones was the value of purpose. I'm not talking about your own purpose in investing, although that's really important, investing your own energy. But what I'm talking about is how rare it is that a leader and a person, you know, articulates purpose in what the group or the organization is up to, what they're trying to do. Who's heard the term, you know, big, hairy, audacious goal? BHAG, you hear it sometimes. You know, the idea is we're often reticent as leaders to aim high, to be bold, and to say here, and to frame what we're all doing in kind of a grand way. And I think that organizations want that. The world wants leaders that do that, and it's actually available to any of us because it's just about framing. And so here's one example. You know, I get when I was at the phone company and I was there. This was in the mid '80s, and as I said, I wasn't happy there. And it turned out that my father also worked there, and he was in senior management. And I remember sitting down with him one day, and we would have lunch every once in a while, and he said, "How's it going?" I said, "It's terrible. I feel like what I'm doing, my purpose is to make money for shareholders. Tell me that's not what I'm doing." Mm-hmm. And he laughed, and he listened, and he said, "You know, I don't like to look at it that way. The way I like to look at it is, we're building the infrastructure for the 5th largest economy in the world, California. The 5th largest economy in the world. And if we went away, what would happen to this economy? And what about all those people who need to make phone calls to tell their spouse they love them, or to conduct a business transaction, or to educate a student or whatnot?" Right. And I thought, wow. I didn't like the answer, first of all. Because I wanted to hear him say, "Yeah, you're right, and you should probably just leave anyway." And I thought about that, and I thought, wow, it's all about framing, isn't it? What's passion really mean? I want to pursue my passion. It's so much about how you frame what you're doing. And I'm not saying make it up and invent passion when it's not really there, but it's so much about framing. And so this idea of purpose, and this sense of his sense of purpose. And I think we're often too reticent to proclaim the high ground and say, here's the way I and we are going to change the world.
Right.
And people love that. The people that work for you and with you rally around that. Second thing is authenticity. And that term is thrown around so liberally, right? And I think at the end of the day, so much of what I've learned is to really, really, truly care about people, not on the face of it, but truly care about people. At the end of, and I'll shut up in a minute here, I know I'm droning on, but at the end of my time at Pacificville, I was very successful there, and I ended up quitting. And when I was quitting, I took my team of managers to lunch, and we were just saying our goodbyes, and I said, let me ask you a question. What was it that made you all motivated to work for me? And I really wanted to hear, oh, it was that fancy program that you put in over here, and that idea you had there, and the structure that you invented here. And I was incredibly disappointed when they said, you just cared about us. I thought, I could have saved myself so much energy. And I said, that's it? Like, that's the punchline, because I cared about you? Are you kidding me? And I was really disappointed, to be honest with you, at first. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought, okay, I get it. I get what they're really saying.
So how have you applied that? That's a great life lesson. What's an example of application of that later in life? Did that change the way you looked at things or did things?
Yeah, just briefly. It helped me really engage. I never underestimated the importance of engaging in people's experience in their life. Now, you as a professional, you do have to keep work and people's individual lives separate and respect those boundaries. But on the other hand, being willing to open yourself up and hear what people that are with you, working for you, and people working above you too, seek the same kind of connection. To me, that's authenticity.
So take that same idea, you work globally in your practice or your consulting. I think a lot of people didn't know that Korn Ferry does a lot of consulting, but they really do. They work closely, and Bob McNabb, who's on our board of visitors, is a EVP of Korn Ferry, and it was actually a great partner for us as we started this whole leadership program. But if you think about taking these two lessons about, it's not the structure, it's not the great speech, it's not your charismatic personality, how have you applied that across cultures or different places in the world? Does it play out differently?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I see there's many people who was not born and raised in the United States. Raise your hand. So close to half, it looks like. I spent a year in Japan, as I said. It took me about 6 months to realize, who's heard, all of us have heard this idea, well, when you are going to work in an international context, either living or just working with international groups, step in their shoes, right? Look at the world through their eyes. There's a big difference, I think, between conceptually knowing that and really internalizing and really doing it, because you have to truly suspend your own lens and your own biases. Truly suspend. When I was in Japan, for example, who's from Japan here? Anybody? Good, I could talk freely then. And I would anyway, but it's very difficult, and maybe you've read some of this before, to get a very direct, straight answer, especially in a group setting in Japan, working with Japanese professionals. And we've all read that, or if you go there, it'll be the first of a list of 10 things culturally to watch out for. But what ends up happening in the heat of the moment is, as a professional trying to get something done, you start to get frustrated. And what happens with stress starts to come up, right? All of your old patterns of behavior start coming right back in. And you stop walking in their shoes, right? And so this is a learned skill. And if you think about it, and this is the last point, is to really, really become a student of why these things exist. In Japan, you've got little less than half, but a large population of half the size of the United States, crammed in the size of California. If people were highly direct with each other like we are with each other, we just think it's second nature, right? What would happen, right? You'd have fights in the streets, right? You can't conduct society in a way with that kind of direct, almost confrontation that we're just used to here, because the spaces are so small. So knowing that and seeing how that plays out in the supermarket, right, in the tourist spot down the street, gives you great insight. But then you really, that's really walking in the shoes of the culture. So I think it's the lesson is, don't just read it as words on the paper. Really, really suspend your own biases and truly step into it.
Does that raise any questions from, we have a lot of people from a lot of parts of the world. Your own experiences or questions you might have on that question? Yes.
Unrelated question. I think
Okay.
it's slightly similar.
Sure.
I'm Aaron. I'm a full-time MBA. I'm concentrating in finance and HOB. There's been a lot of research done on the cultural differences between baby boomers, Gen X, and Gen Y. I think a lot of us right now are studying some of these contrasts between older and younger employees. When your clients come to ask you for advice on how to attract, retain, and develop young professionals, what do you say to them?
I say the rumors of our generation's demise are greatly exaggerated. And what I mean by that is this: I actually think I did a project on this when I was at Accenture about 6 years ago. This exact question, and what we came to was the conclusion that it's overestimated. The importance is overestimated. So let me explain that a bit. At the end of the day, I think what we all want is interesting work, opportunities to grow, feedback and development, managers who are interested in our personal journey, right? And to me, Aaron, that transcends gender. Now, tactically, there's difference. There's no doubt the practicalities of how that plays out differ and are important. But to me, that's around the edges. I think if the intention is there to do those things I described, the core needs are ubiquitous. I really do believe that. And in fact, I think those core needs are ubiquitous across cultures as well, national cultures. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Do you believe it or not?
Well, personally, having worked in an environment where most of my colleagues are 40 years older than me, I think it's tough to convince people that the way we do things as younger professionals is just as good or relevant as the way they did it. I just see a lot of challenges for people like us working with people who are 50 or 60 because there's less of an acceptance of the way we do things. It's not that we're doing it right or wrong, it's just they're not used to it. So, I don't know, you see that in
yeah.
research.
So what do you do with that? So you have a dilemma, right? Because you see opportunities to do things differently. The structure in place is going to resist you. And so you have what are you going to do, right? The thing I see a lot of young people do, not a lot, but I see this come up a bit, is they'll rebel against it and try to change the system, if you will, and just say, well, our way is simply better, right? And it could be practically the way we use social media, or it could be something bigger. So the question is, how are you going to respond and work within the system to influence change and get what you need at the same time? And there's no, I'm not going to give you one answer. There's not one answer, obviously, but I think the fundamental question you've got to ask yourself is, given what you're trying to affect, how do you do it?
It's interesting. I get, and I know many of you will now work or will later work in organizations where there won't be a lot of people exactly like you around. Some of you will be fortunate enough, perhaps, that is the case, but many of you will be the sole person in a team or in an organization or a department or somewhere. And I suspect as you graduate from this organization, this school, you probably feel, I felt that way prior in life, that I could probably take 4 or 5 of my closest friends and we could probably solve most of the problems of human life. There were not many that we didn't think we had the answer to and could come to in short order. And so I get what I call as the 3-month call or the 6-month call. It's about 3 months or 6 months after graduation, and I'll get a call every year from 1 or 2 of our graduates and saying, life's hell. I have to work on Fridays. There's not a keg on Thursday night. I don't understand this. And by the way, I'm with a whole bunch of people that don't do the valuation analysis like I do it, or they don't do this like I do it, or that, or this, whatever the problem set is. And so they don't have command and control authority. They can't drive the organization. And so it's working in a complex where you want to influence the actions of others, but you don't have the command and control to do it. So how do you do that? I guess that'd be my follow-on question is, what advice would you have for somebody working in a matrix organization or where you have to influence the members of your team? Are there any aha moments or takeaways or maybe something you've taught or learned along the way?
How do you influence without authority?
Yes. I found bribery works, but you run out of money pretty quickly.
I had a leader that at Accenture, and he was a leadership guy. He
Right.
consulted on leadership, and I asked him one time, what's your definition of leadership? Right, and there's 1,000, there's
Yeah.
100,000 out there.
Right.
He said, leaders make things happen. And at first I thought, that's the most disappointing definition I've ever heard. And then the more I thought about it, the more I thought, wow, that is really a cool definition, because if you think about what it actually takes to make something happen, right, you do have to influence, you do have to pull the right decision at the right time, make the right move at the right time, bring the right skills, develop yourself and so forth for that moment. But I think a lot of it has to do, I'm not going to be the expert on influencing without authority. It's critical though, and I'm seeing this, there's a huge trend in the area of leadership, and it's this exact area. And I think this actually, Aaron, this is something that the younger, newer generations coming into the workforce may be better suited to do. And so the question that's going to lead to you to think about, everybody, is how to action that over time. But that is, we're entering a period where networked organizations, highly matrixed organizations, leaders that have a lower degree of organizational authority are becoming more and more important and more successful, right? And however that's playing out. I think a big part of influencing is to understand motives, understand what the organization is really trying to accomplish, try to read through the words to the actions, and then trying to get to the real motives of people around and what's going to move people. J.P. Morgan, the great industrialist, had a wonderful quote. He said, every man, this was 100 years ago, so every man has 2 reasons for doing things, the right reason and the real reason. And I think it's easy for us, especially coming out of business schools, and Lord knows I suffered from this for years, that there's the right answer. It's on paper. I did the NPV. You select the highest NPV and go, right? Or here, now as a consultant, this was grilled into me. You do your elegant analysis. You have the answer. What's the issue, client? Why don't you do this, right? Well, the truth is there's the real reason why people around you either don't or do the things that are the right things to do, that are obvious to do. So I think, that would just be something I would leave you with as you think about it. The last thing is some of the themes we talked about, really opening up and listening. I think the key of it, not surprising, is trust-based relationships. I'm sure you talk about that. Again, building trust throughout the organization, not just in your formal line of authority, either up or down, but throughout, across boundaries, is really essential, because when you need to make change and bring diverse teams together, having that base of trust in all the ways that you can develop that trust, authenticity, self-disclosure, good listening, and so forth, and a myriad of other ways, is critical. It's the glue.
I learned some of probably the best lessons in life were things I failed at or was a problem that didn't go right, the answer didn't come out like you wanted it to. They were sometimes very painful, but they taught you a lot. Do you have that experience? What did you learn something from a mistake, or why do we hang on to that? What is it that drives that so far into our culture that you learn sometimes most from the mistakes you make?
Yeah. I think that failure is there's more being written about this. It's the great undervalued leadership experience. And failure can be the greatest gift in the world. And I think corporations are actually starting to get on this idea that if you haven't had a significant failure in your career, you won't make it to higher levels of management. There's two parts of it: the failure, and then your own reflection about the failure. You're learning from the failure. At Procter & Gamble, A.G. Lafley, who's the outgoing CEO there, in his identification of future executives, their high potential group, he demanded that each one of them have what they called a crucible experience. And that's an experience where it was highly risky for the executive, and usually they failed. And sometimes the failure could be material. He demanded that they have that kind of experience and that they learn from that experience. There's a wonderful story from, just briefly, from Thomas Watson Jr., who was the great president and leader for IBM for many, many years. His father founded the company, where a manager one of his execs made a very serious mistake and cost the corporation $1 million. This was in the mid-'60s, which in today's dollars, the finance people can figure that out pretty quickly. It's a big number. And the manager, the executive he got called into Watson's office, and he sat down, and Watson just stared at him like this for a few moments. And the leader said, "Just do it, get it over with. I know why I'm sitting here. Just fire me." And Watson looked at him and said, "Do you take me for a fool, son? I just invested $1 million in your development." Well, he was a wise leader, right? And so this idea of valuing that failure. So my failure was not so much a mistake, but I was passed over for promotion twice at Accenture to partner, and I was devastated by it. And the second time, I was really devastated, and I took this was just 5 or 6 years ago. I took a step back and I thought, what am I doing? What am I doing? And for a long time, the lesson was I was blaming the organization. They're not seeing the value in me. They're making a mistake. How could they, right, kind of thing. How did that person get it over me? I could show you how I was better, right, on paper. I had to take a step back and say, how am I showing up, and what am I doing that's causing this situation, right? And I learned, I took a few things away from that, that were critical. But the critical piece was owning the situation rather than blaming. I know it's easy to say, but think about it. Truly doing that and getting past your disappointment and anger was really key.
Right. So I guess just I had the good fortune of working. The best mentor I had in life was a guy that hired me, and he said, "I expect you to be right more than half the time. If you're not right more than half the time," that's a pretty good batting average for a ball player, right? But if you're not right more than half the time, then I'm going to fire you. So that's the bar. But if you're right all the time, or a large majority of the time, you're not pushing the envelope. You're not pushing yourself. You're not pushing this organization. You're not doing what I want you to do, and I'll fire you for that reason. Right. So it's kind of like this. Okay, So those were great. I think the other thing is, having got to where you are, one of the interesting pieces to me is, I think one of the gifts is the ability to allow people that you're working with to make a mistake and learn from that, and not to reach in there and just because they're doing it differently. Have you had experiences like that? Do you teach that?
Yeah, it's a really interesting thing that what I see is two different leaders show up. I see this in many organizations. Leaders at the end of the day who are managing through fear, right? And there's various ways that they do that, but at the end of the day, their intention is to manage through fear.
Right.
They don't trust what people are doing necessarily. They're going to create a competitive environment where people's jobs are always at risk. Okay? And by the way, I'm not going to say one is better than the other, right? The other is a highly inclusive way of managing. right? And so and I didn't believe this earlier because I'm a very inclusive leader, but I've become to appreciate that there might be times when actually managing through, maybe fear is not the right word, maybe it's a competitive environment where nobody really feels safe in their jobs. Maybe there's a place for that sometimes. What's critical is to know strategically what is it time for your particular challenge, your particular industry or organization, right? And make a conscious choice about that. But one of the costs of a fear-based structure is that people will take fewer risks, and that mistakes will not be tolerated. So you just have to be aware of that.
So Korn Ferry charges about $12 gazillion an hour to come do consulting for you. You should know that. And you're sitting here with one of the great folks in life who knows a lot about leadership and organizations and how to develop others. I think that's a great skill for people to learn to develop others. Some questions? Anybody got something?
I'm Stuart Kaplan, one of the MMHC students, and I have a couple of questions for you. I was wondering if you could comment on if and how physician leaders differ from other organizational leaders, and if and how female leaders differ from males.
Oh boy.
You got 2 minutes to answer that one.
The second one, and I'm sorry to disappoint, I think that I would be, I can only disappoint by answering that question in the sense that is such a rich topic. And I'm not deeply expert, I'll be totally honest with you in that. I think it deserves an expert answer actually, and it's out there. There are huge differences, and I think one of the things I'll comment on the second one is there is a greater recognition of those differences. And I think that there's great strides I'm seeing of late, the last couple of years, to truly begin to diversify the highest levels of management, board level. It's actually a very common dialogue at the board level right now around diversity and the lack of, frankly, to be blunt, the lack of women on boards. So, hopefully that will, but in terms of the characteristics, I'm gonna not go there now. In terms of physicians, it's very common for any deep functional expertise, and this is the thing that I think is generalizable across. You're at a point where you've built a career, a physician that's been successful has built a career on a deep functional expertise, and you can go pretty far in your career, but at some point you're going to reach that level that your functional depth and everything that got you here won't get you there, right? That's where you've got to start making that leap to those broader leadership, and it's individual, right? I can't begin to speculate the particular pieces of it, but I think being a physician is a lot like being an IT expert, no offense, or an engineer, or any deep expert that now has to step outside of, and I think it's very, very difficult for a functional expert to let go of. I mean, you're asking the person to let go of everything that made them successful, right? Not everything. Keep the things that are there for gems, but start to grow and move on from there.
Other questions? Yes.
My name is Hai Kwan. I am with the Executive MBA program first year. And my question is, what separates a good leader from a great leader?
Oh, goodness.
I'm glad they're giving these easy questions. I know.
Let me give you one. I mean, there's probably many, but I think a great leader understands what it's time for now. What is it time for now? And the biggest challenge that I face as a leader, as a COO, which is probably the most ill-defined job definition in any company, but I think all leaders deal with this. Once you reach a certain level, the most difficult thing is choosing what to spend your time on. There's 25 things that you must spend your time on, and you only have time for 6. Literally, it plays out that way. I wish I was kidding. For my own sanity, I wish I was kidding. Choosing those 6, which is another variant of what is it time for now in our organization, which is a strategic question. What's our strategy? Really, fundamentally, what's our strategy, which many organizations, I'm sorry to say, are ambiguous about. And what does that imply about what does that imply about what's most important for our organization, and what my role in what's most important is? And not just my role, but how I show up and communicate, and decisions I make, and so forth. And so I think what I'm describing here is alignment, aligning how you're spending your time and what's it time for now with what's truly important as defined by the strategy and outcomes of the organization. There's many style things the leader does, some of which I've talked about, but let me stop on that one idea.
The definition of a COO's job is to do anything the CEO doesn't want to do. I don't.
So does that mean the CEO is not focused on the right stuff, maybe?
Absolutely. It happens. It happens sometimes. Yes.
I'm Christy Morrow, I'm with the Executive MBA program. Looking back now that you're out of business school and have a lot more experience, what would you suggest to us as we are going through business school, looking back saying, here's what I would have done differently or something I would have focused on that maybe at the time didn't seem as important
Yeah.
as it does now?
Yeah, step outside your comfort zone. And I would say this in business school because it's a relatively risk-free environment. But I think it's also true in your career, and not just in your early stages of your career, throughout, this idea of the Procter & Gamble crucible experiences. The mistake I made, and I made it through much of my career until just maybe the last 5 or 6 years, was over-reading the risk involved in failure. I overestimated how serious the consequences would be. And I wish I'd taken many more risks. And so in business school, that might show up as doing something, taking a role on a project, or taking a course that is utterly out of your comfort zone and that you loathe, you hate, right? Taking statistics if you hate statistics, right?
Why would you pick statistics? I don't know.
I think the laughter answered your question. And choosing a topic for a project work that's in an industry that you know nothing about, right? And so I think that's critical. I think so it's not only taking most advantage of the time, but I see this in careers as well, that people overestimate the consequences of failure or risk. Now, you guys got to be smart, right? There's a bottom point of failure. But I think the bottom point is much lower than we typically think it is.
So we have time for one more question, and I have several. And Larry, if you want to come down and set up, we invite you to do that so that it'll make your transition easier. One more question? Yes.
I'm Anne Marie, first year in the MBA program. My question is kind of around social media. How do you see Facebook and LinkedIn and Twitter affecting businesses and how leaders run those businesses?
There's wonderful news for you. We don't know. And I guess maybe this is a variant of Aaron's question. I think you actually are uniquely positioned to answer that question. Leaders that I work with, I think and maybe you'll have I'll leave a moment, because I think that this could be to you as well. I think we all know as leaders that social media is truly transforming the way teams interact and the way people interact with each other. That's a given. What does that truly mean? How does it play out? What are the business opportunities within that for my particular product or service, right? How is that going to change the way that I attract great talent and retain them and develop them? How is it going to change the way I communicate with my customers? I don't think we know at all. Now, you could have an expert in social media sit up here and cite all kinds of ways that they're going to change the world. But I think that's just one idea, right? There's 1,000 different ways it's going to happen. Totally dodging the question, because I truly don't know. I think that's the world is hungry for leaders, and many of you in the room may fall in this category who can help answer that question and then make it happen. Remember, the leaders make things happen, is to make it happen. The idea is just not enough, and you got to make it happen. But I would leave with that. I don't know.
We
Jim,
have
you
a
see this.
tradition here, and I agree with you. There's some great examples of, here in Nashville, there's one of the publishing companies uses social media and gives away their publications online and elsewhere to gain endorsement or even criticism of their work. And what they've found is by doing that, by gaining this kind of grassroots endorsement or at least comment on a product, they have seen the products they've done that with, and they're in the publishing business, they've had 1 million seller copy for every time they've tried that experiment. So what we found, I think more than anything else, is if I'm buying a new sprocket for my bicycle or something like that, or a new toy, something for my camera, I'm more likely to go online and get the endorsement of 10,000 people I don't know than I am reading the technical stuff. And so it can be a great tool, but I think the scope of that, where you overturn governments and do all kinds of things with social media, the power of it is amazing, and how you watch some organizations that kind of clamp it down and say, we can't do this anymore. We'll just ban it, but that obviously doesn't work.
I think the biggest fear, just one last comment, is that you're going to somehow cannibalize your
Yeah.
business
Right.
with what you don't know. Is Napster going to kill the record business, right? That's like one of the biggest fears corporate executives have, because you don't know, and you need to play in the space around social media and new technology, but you don't know how, and you're greatly worried that in fact you're going to cannibalize your core business.
I want to end on a couple of just kind of questions we took out of interviews that employers bring up, and you get a one-word answer, or maybe two. These are not long answer dissertations. Who taught you the most?
My spouse, my wife.
Her biggest complaint about you? Yes or no? You have a spouse. There is a complaint. I'll share mine if you'll share yours. Yeah.
Then I'm too stubborn.
Okay.
It's true.
I put too much on my plate as hers. You never make time for me. What advice would you leave this audience with our students with?
Take risks. I've said, this has been one of the themes I've talked about, is take risks, and don't fear failure.
Okay. Thanks so much for being here today, and thank you, and help me take my class.